exclusively here on Times Radio tomorrow at midday. Now, young adults are flying the nest only to boomerang back to their family home by the average age of 26, according to new research by NatWest. The survey found the main reason for the trend was financial, helping the returning offspring to save up a deposit for their own home. So for tonight's discussion, I've been discussing this so-called boomerang effect with Lloyd Cochrane, Head of Mortgages at NatWest, and Ben Cope, political commentator at Young Voices UK. And I began by asking Ben what he makes of the statistics.
I think it's really sad news that shows that across the country, many young Britons aren't allowed to sort of really get started with their adult lives because housing is just becoming more and more unaffordable. That's stopping them moving out and, getting on with the things they want to do.
And is this just about the price of property, the difficulties of trying to save up enough to put down a deposit, or are there wider issues about things like the levels of student debt and so on?
I think it's almost exclusively due to the high cost of housing. So mortgages have been out of reach for most young people for quite some time. Rents in particular have increased at a much faster rate and, are thought to go even higher due to some of the recent regulations that have gone through, forcing some landlords to sell up. So, I think it's almost exclusively just due to young people not being able to afford to move out.
Lloyd, clearly this is a huge problem, isn't it, for young people? And presumably it's particularly difficult in the big cities, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a problem, as you said, nationwide. But the big cities where most of young people's jobs are where rents are particularly high and where property prices are particularly high. So, you're right about the concentration in big cities.
And you're talking there about rents as well as property prices.
Yeah, I think that the challenge with rents, and this is part of what the research shows, is that a high rent together with other high cost of living means young people, once they've moved out, really struggle to put money aside for the deposit for a first home, which is one of the reasons I think when we see the research that a quarter are heading back home to live with mum and dad after a few years of living in rental accommodation. So the empty nest isn't empty for long, it seems.
Speaking as a mum who's had an empty nest but does find that the big kids boomerang back and one of them's about to come back for a few more weeks, I mean, it's something I actually quite welcome. Ben, how much of a problem do you think it is for the young people? Maybe it's more of a problem for them than it is for mum and dad.
So I think for some people, for some families, this will work, and but there might be a bit of a culture shift away from moving out at 18 to actually having a bit more of a sort of cohesive family unit, a bit sort of longer into young adult life. But I think we should acknowledge that this is a situation that's sort of not primarily driven by choice, but by necessity. And as Lloyd was saying, I think there are big knock-on effects for jobs and careers here. So I think this is for young people, this is bad news.
Lloyd, we've had successive governments talking about tackling the housing crisis, endless targets for home building, none of which seem to have been hit. But this government is making it easier to get new developments built and so on. But presumably, I mean, that's not really yet feeding into the overall supply of housing and thus the cost.
No, I think it's what we see as good early signs. Our role as a bank is to support homeowners and would-be homeowners. It's to support businesses up and down the UK, including house builders, including housing associations, so that we provide support to all aspects of the housing supply chain, if you like. But I think that you're right. The early moves by the government are very welcomed by ourselves and by the housing community, but there's still a huge amount more to do, and there is always a lag between the policy actions that open up planning, particularly, and actually, houses being built, people being able to move into them.
And Ben, do you welcome what this government is doing on house building? Because it is trying to get rid of some of the rules and regulations to make it easier to get more properties built.
I welcome the rhetoric to back the builders rather than the blockers, but I'm not convinced that the policy has gone far enough. I think that the case in point here is the National Planning Policy Framework, which I think the model that they use to allocate various targets throughout the country just didn't make any sense. It even cut the target for London, the area which has obviously the most severe housing crisis. So I think while attempts to build more on brownfield sites or newly defined greyfield sites, I think it's I'm not convinced.
Lloyd, we're also seeing figures about the extent to which many young people are helped out by the bank of mum and dad. But if mum and dad are of a generation that have benefited from rising property prices, is that not perhaps, a good way to go ahead for those parents who can afford to help out the kids to get onto the housing ladder?
Yes, it is. We see in our standard business, we help about 1 in 8 first-time buyers get their first home. In that part of our business, we often see the bank of mum and dad helping out with the deposit. The other thing that we launched a couple of weeks ago, and this research is part of, is a family-backed mortgage where a mum or dad, a family member, can get onto the same mortgage as a first-time buyer. So some of their income can help the first-time buyer borrow that bit more than they can do on their own. It means that would-be first-time buyer gets on the ladder slightly earlier, or they could buy a slightly bigger property, say a 2-bedroom place, not a 1-bedroom place. So there's a number of ways in which families and partnerships in general can work together to help people get on the ladder.
Ben, is that something that you'd welcome?
I think within each families that sounds like a good idea, but on a societal level, relying on effectively a form of inheritance to get on the housing ladder, I don't think that's sustainable.
Yeah, because Ben, presumably part of the problem here is that it entrenches inequalities, doesn't it? Because if you're from a wealthier background, a wealthier family who can afford to help you out, then you're getting a leg up which others won't be able to benefit from.
I entirely agree. I think it's this inequality point, and we hear a lot about the great wealth transfer as a lot of people in the so-called boomer generation pass on money to their children, and that being a sort of a great thing to allowing their children to get onto the property ladder. But we have to remember that that's not everyone is receiving money, not everyone's receiving the same amount of money. So I think it's we need to fix the policy here rather than rely on wealth transfers.
And how would you like the policy to change then, Ben, just before I go back to Lloyd on this?
I'd like to see higher targets. I'd like to see a change in the incentives for local government, whereby that there's whether it's some form of sort of land value tax or something like that would recoup some of the benefits that would be gained from building more. I think that at the moment all the incentives are wrong, whereby local councils and councillors are elected to block new builds rather than build them. So I think we've got to change the incentive structure rather than just tinkering around the edges.
Lloyd, what about that point that it's all very well relying on the bank of mum and dad, presumably, so long as mum and dad have got some money in the bank? And it just means that if you're from a difficult background, if you're from a broken home, that you're simply going to not be able to benefit in the way that others of your generation might.
Yeah, look, I think that is a real challenge, and the inequality that Ben's talked about is definitely an issue. I think from our point of view, what we make sure we do is help as many customers as we possibly can and support as many businesses as we possibly can, and that's really where our role lies.
Just finally then, to both of you, I mean, Ben, we keep hearing about the fact that there is a big divide between the generations, but that in fact all generations benefit quite a bit if they can establish closer bonds. I mean, don't these trends perhaps put us back in a pathway where we might live together more as extended families?
I think that that works that works when it's done by choice. I think at the moment we're seeing it done just by young people not having the option to move out. There are obviously a lot of benefits from closer familial ties, but I don't think this is the right way to do it.
Lloyd, your thoughts on that?
I think where it's possible, it's always preferable. But I think that the lives and working patterns are ever more complex. I think where we come in is to try and provide choices for customers so that they can team up together if they want to get on the housing ladder, and if that isn't something that works for them, they can find other routes to get into ownership, be that on their own or with a deposit share from a parent, or potentially into something like shared ownership. So there's a whole mix of things I think that people do to team up together to find ways to own a home.
Or perhaps even borrowing more money so that they can extend the family home so that they can accommodate more family members.
Yeah, potentially, absolutely.
Lloyd Cochrane, Head of Mortgages at NatWest, and Ben Cope, political commentator at Young Voices UK.